The letter hit the floor of the Wilcox Ranch kitchen with a sound like a gunshot, and Catherine Fletcher stood over it the way a woman stands over something she cannot take back. "You lied to me," she said, and her voice was so quiet that Cyrus Wilcox had to lean forward just to hear the accusation. "You told me your wife left. You told me she walked out on you and those boys and never looked back. But this letter," she picked it up, her fingers trembling so badly the paper shook. "This letter says she died, Cyrus. She died of fever 2 winters ago, and you let me come here thinking I was filling a vacancy she created by choice." Cyrus stood at the far side of the kitchen table, 6 feet and 2 inches of hard-edged rancher, his jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. The oil lamp between them threw shadows across his face that made him look older than his 34 years, carved deeper by something that went beyond grief and into the territory of guilt. "It was easier," he said. "Easier." She repeated the word as though she were testing its weight and finding it catastrophically insufficient. "You brought me out here from Boston on the pretense of teaching your sons, and you let me believe their mother was a woman who simply did not love them enough to stay. Do you have any idea what that did to those children? Do you have any idea what it did to me?" The youngest boy, 7-year-old Thomas, appeared in the doorway then, sock feet silent on the plank floor, his wide brown eyes moving between his father and the woman who had become, over the course of 6 weeks, the closest thing to a steady presence he had known since the world went sideways. "Miss Fletcher," Thomas said, "are you leaving?" And that single question, delivered in a voice so careful and so braced for abandonment, was the thing that cracked the moment open and made it something larger than a confrontation between two adults who had developed feelings neither had planned for. Catherine pressed her eyes shut. She breathed. She had not always been a woman who ran toward difficult things. Once, in Boston in the spring of 1883, she had been a woman who ran away from them with considerable speed and impressive efficiency. It had started, as so many terrible and transformative things do, with a notice in a newspaper. The Boston Evening Transcript, March 14, 1883, page 4, column 3, between an advertisement for imported wool fabric and a notice about a lecture on phrenology that Catherine had no intention of attending. Schoolteacher wanted, Dust Creek, Colorado Territory, 3 boys in need of proper instruction, situated ranch property. Meals and board provided, salary negotiable, inquire by letter to C. Wilcox, general delivery, Dust Creek. Catherine had read it 3 times before she set the paper down, and then she had picked it back up and read it twice more. She was 28 years old. She had been teaching at the Whitmore Academy for Girls for 4 years, an institution she had loved in theory and increasingly resented in practice, primarily because the head mistress, a woman named Mrs. Arabella Cross, had recently made clear that Catherine's position was contingent on her remaining unmarried, and by extension, unremarkable in all the ways that mattered to a woman who believed teachers should be as close to furniture as possible. Catherine had not been the kind of person who tolerated being treated like furniture. She had also recently survived the dissolution of an engagement to a man named Edmund Price, a lawyer of moderate success and immoderate self-regard, who had informed her 6 weeks before their planned wedding that he had decided to marry a woman whose family had more money and fewer opinions. The betrayal had been clean and surgical in the way that only a man of Edmund's particular emotional cowardice could manage, and Catherine had spent the subsequent weeks discovering that grief and fury, when combined in sufficient quantities, produced something very close to courage. The advertisement in the transcript was not a respectable opportunity. Her mother told her so repeatedly, and at increasing volume. Teachers of quality did not relocate to the Colorado Territory. Teachers of quality did not enter arrangements with unknown men in frontier settlements, where civilization was still a relatively recent and apparently optional development. Teachers of quality. Catherine had written the letter before her mother finished the sentence. She had asked direct questions. How old were the boys? What materials were available for instruction? What were the expectations regarding duration of employment? She had included a list of her credentials, her years of experience, the subjects she was prepared to teach, and a note at the end that she was a serious professional who expected to be treated as such. The reply came 3 weeks later in handwriting that was controlled but not elegant. The letters formed with the practicality of a man who had learned to write because he needed to and not because anyone had made it beautiful for him. C. Wilcox had written back, "Boys are aged 14, 11, and 7. Materials are limited. Duration is open. I run a cattle ranch 20 miles southeast of Dusk Creek. It is not Boston. The work is real and the need is real. I am not a man who writes long letters, but I will say plainly that my sons need someone who will take them seriously. Their mother is gone. I have managed as best I can, and it has not been enough. Salary is $40 a month plus full board. The position is yours if you want it." He had not asked her to prove herself further. He had not demanded additional references or inquired about her family background or suggested that the position was conditional on her meeting some unspoken standard of femininity. He had stated a need, offered a fair arrangement, and left the decision to her. She had wanted it. The train from Boston to Denver had taken 4 days, during which Catherine had read 2 novels, consumed a dangerous amount of terrible coffee, and had a long conversation with a woman named Harriet Buell who was traveling to meet a husband she had agreed to marry entirely by correspondence, and who seemed simultaneously terrified and thrilled about the whole enterprise. "Are you not afraid?" Catherine had asked. "Constantly," Harriet said. "But I was afraid in Ohio too, and at least out there I'll have something to be afraid of that's worth the trouble." Catherine had thought about that for a long time as the landscape outside the window transformed from the green and ordered east into something wider and more honest. The stage from Denver to Dusk Creek had taken another day and a half across country that felt, to Catherine's Boston-adjusted eyes, aggressively large. She arrived in Dusk Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 1883. Covered in the particular coating of dust that the Colorado Territory applied to all newcomers as a kind of territorial tax, and found that the town was considerably smaller than she had imagined and considerably more real. Dusk Creek was a main street of maybe 300 feet, a general store, a post office, a saloon that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, a livery, a church that looked newer than everything around it, and a scattering of homes in various states of ambition. The population was perhaps 400 people, a number that seemed to include everyone within a reasonable riding distance, and the air smelled of horses and pine, and the particular freshness of altitude that Catherine had not expected to find appealing and immediately did. The man waiting near the stage depot was not what she had imagined from his letter. She had formed a picture in her mind during the long journey westward, a generalized notion of a frontier rancher, weathered and rough in the way that the dime novels she had consumed as a teenager suggested all Western men were weathered and rough. She had not imagined someone who stood the way Cyrus Wilcox stood, which was with his weight balanced and his attention complete, watching the stage arrive with the focused stillness of a man who had learned that paying attention was the primary way you stayed alive in a place that was still inventing its own rules. He was broad-shouldered in a worn canvas coat the color of dried grass. His hat was dark brown and shaped by years of actual use rather than any intentional fashion. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the kind of distances that Boston did not offer. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, which matched approximately with what she had calculated from the ages of his boys, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, which in itself was notable because Catherine Fletcher had always been very good at reading expressions. "Miss Fletcher," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. It was not a question either. He picked up her trunk without asking, which she noted, and he said, "The boys are at the ranch. I left them with our neighbor, Ada Chen. She runs the laundry in town, but she lives out on the Eastern Road." "Thank you for meeting me," Catherine said. "Seemed appropriate," he said, and he loaded her trunk into the back of a wagon that had clearly been used recently to transport things far less genteel than trunks, and he offered his hand to help her up to the seat. And when she took it, she noticed that his hand was warm and the calluses on it were the honest kind. The drive to the ranch took nearly an hour on a road that used the word road loosely, and Cyrus Wilcox spoke during that time with the deliberate economy of a man who had decided that words were a resource and should be spent carefully. He told her the names of the mountains she was looking at. He told her about the water rights situation on the eastern boundary of his property, which was apparently a source of ongoing dispute with a neighboring rancher named Beaumont. He told her that the nearest doctor was 18 miles away in a town called Porter's Crossing, and that the nearest library was in Denver, which was why the boy's education had been conducted primarily through a collection of books his late wife had owned. He said, "My late wife," without looking at her, and Catherine absorbed this as information without comment. He had not mentioned in his letter that his wife had died. He had said only that she was gone, which Catherine had interpreted as abandonment and which she now understood, hearing the flat, controlled way he said the word late, was something else entirely. She did not press him on it. It was not her first hour in his company, and the topic seemed too large for a wagon seat on a road that required both hands for the reins. The ranch itself appeared around a bend in the road as the afternoon light was going gold, and it was more than she had expected. Not grand, not prosperous in any showy way, but solid. The house was 2 stories of timber with a porch that ran the full front length, and there were outbuildings in reasonable repair, and a barn that had been built by someone who understood that a good barn is a form of argument against chaos. Cattle dotted the lower pasture. A creek ran silver through the near edge of the property, and standing on the porch, arranged in descending order of height like a very serious set of stairs, were 3 boys. The oldest was Samuel, 14, tall for his age with his father's dark hair, and a way of holding himself that suggested he had been designated the man of the house in his father's frequent absences, and had not entirely forgiven the designation. His expression when Catherine climbed down from the wagon was evaluating and not particularly warm. The middle one was James, 11, with his mother's coloring apparently, lighter hair and eyes that were hazel and quick. He was studying her with undisguised scientific interest, the way a person looks at something they are not certain, yet whether to classify as a threat or an opportunity. And Thomas, 7, stood slightly behind his brothers with his thumb pressed against the side of his leg in a gesture that was almost but not quite a self-comforting gesture. And when Catherine looked directly at him, he looked back at her with eyes that were enormous and brown, and containing something she recognized as the particular wariness of a child who had been disappointed before and was managing his expectations accordingly. "Boys," Cyrus said, "this is Miss Fletcher. She's come to teach you." Samuel said, "Yes, sir." James said, "Hello, Miss Fletcher. Do you know mathematics?" Thomas said nothing, but he took a single step forward, just one which Catherine would later understand was, for Thomas, the equivalent of a full embrace. She said, "Hello, Samuel. Hello, James. Hello, Thomas. I know mathematics, and I know geography, and I know literature, and I know history, and I know how to teach all 4 of them in ways that are not entirely horrible. I'm very glad to meet you." James said, "That's a lot of things." "It is," Catherine agreed. "I've had time to accumulate them." The following weeks established themselves into a rhythm that Catherine had not anticipated finding so quickly. She had expected the adjustment to be difficult, and in practical terms it was. The house had 1 spare bedroom with a narrow window that looked east, and a mattress stuffed with what she eventually determined was horsehair, a substance that was warmer than it sounded but considerably less comfortable. The water situation required a pump, and a commitment to physical effort that Catherine's Boston life had not exactly prepared her for. The nearest anything was far away by the standards she had grown up with, but she had not anticipated how much she would love the teaching itself. She converted the front room of the house into a schoolroom on her third morning, moving furniture with Samuel's reluctant assistance and James's enthusiastic interference and Thomas's silent watchfulness, and she organized what was available into something approaching a real educational environment. The books left by Cyrus's late wife, whose name, Catherine learned gradually, had been a better collection than she had expected. There was Shakespeare, and there was a solid mathematics primer, and there was a history of the American continent that was thorough if occasionally biased in the direction of manifest destiny, in ways that Catherine noted aloud, and then corrected with the kind of directness that made James look at her with new appreciation. "You said the book was wrong," James said, on the third day, with the tone of someone encountering a novel and slightly dangerous concept. "The book presents one perspective as though it were the only perspective," Catherine said. "That is a specific kind of wrong. The facts of dates and events are correct. The interpretation of what those facts mean is incomplete." "Father says history is what happened," Samuel said, from the back of the room where he had positioned himself at the largest desk, in a manner that was clearly intended to signal that he was there under protest, and not because anyone had successfully convinced him it was necessary. "Your father is right that history is what happened," Catherine said. "The difficulty is that what happened was experienced by many different people who recorded it very differently. A Ute woman living in the Colorado Territory in 1865 had a different experience of what happened than a cavalry officer in the same territory in the same year. Both of their experiences are history." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to be difficult," he said. "Almost certainly," Catherine agreed. "But I'm going to be consistent about it so you'll know what you're getting." Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of respect. Thomas still had not spoken more than 10 words directly to her by the end of the first week. But on the 7th morning, she found him sitting outside the schoolroom door before she had even come downstairs, waiting with a slate and a piece of chalk, and she understood this as the kind of communication that a very careful child makes when words feel too risky. She sat down on the top porch step beside him and said, "Good morning, Thomas." He said, "Good morning, Miss Fletcher," and he held out the slate, and on it he had drawn something. It took her a moment to understand that it was the ranch, rendered from above in the way a bird might see it, detailed and accurate in ways that revealed a child who paid extraordinarily close attention to the shape of things. "This is remarkable," she said, and she meant it entirely. Thomas took the slate back and looked at it himself for a moment, and then looked at her as though he was evaluating whether she was being sincere, and whatever he found in her face satisfied him, because he gave a single nod and got up and went inside to wait for lessons. It was Cyrus who was difficult to understand. He was present and he was not present, a man who conducted himself around her with a careful formality that was not unfriendly, but was clearly maintained with some effort. He asked her in the evenings how the lessons had gone. He listened to her answers with attention that was complete and not performative, nodding sometimes, asking a follow-up question occasionally that revealed he had been thinking about what she said, and not simply waiting for his turn to stop listening. He ate dinner with them most evenings, when the ranch work permitted. Catherine had taken over the cooking from whatever chaotic arrangement had preceded her, not because it was her job, but because the boys were clearly not being adequately fed, and because she had discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was competent at it. Cyrus had looked at the first decent meal she produced, a proper beef stew with root vegetables and cornbread with an expression she could only describe as startled, and then he had said, "You didn't need to do this," and she had said, "No, but I wanted to," and they had left it there. He worked hard, that was evident. He rose before light and was in the barn before she had the stove started, And there were days when the cattle operation demanded him from sunrise to dark, and she would see him come in at the edge of night with the kind of exhaustion on him that is a physical thing, a weight that settles into the posture. On those evenings, she kept a plate warm and he ate alone after the boys were in bed, and she learned not to comment on this because the independence was something he was holding onto with both hands. But occasionally, on quieter evenings when the ranch work had gone well and the boys were settled, he sat on the porch after dinner, and she sat at the other end and they talked. These conversations were the ones she began to organize her weeks around without fully acknowledging to herself that she was doing so. He talked about the land with a love for it that was not romantic but was deep and specific, the way a person loves a thing they have chosen deliberately and maintained through difficulty. He knew every section of his property in the way you know something you have walked with your own feet and repaired with your own hands. He talked about the difficulties of running cattle in the territory, the water rights dispute with Beaumont that was ongoing and occasionally ugly, the way the winters came in from the northwest, and the particular things you had to do before November to survive them adequately. He asked her about Boston once, about what had made her leave, and she gave him the edited version, the one about wanting a different kind of life, which was true but incomplete. He listened to the edited version and then he said, "Was there a man?" She looked at him. "Why do you ask that?" "Because people generally don't leave what's comfortable unless something made staying too uncomfortable," he said. And for a woman in Boston in 1883, something making staying uncomfortable is usually a man. She considered several responses and then settled on honesty. "There was an engagement that ended badly," she said. "The man in question turned out to be someone I hadn't entirely seen clearly." "That's a generous way to describe someone who hurt you," Cyrus said. "I try to be generous." "I've noticed," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not a casual observation, and the evening got quiet after that in a way that was not uncomfortable. 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, she found the letter. It was not intentional, the finding of it. She had been looking for a missing mathematics primer that James had apparently last been seen with near the desk in the small room off the kitchen that Cyrus used for ranch business, and she had been given permission to look for it, and the letter was not hidden. It was simply on top of a stack of papers, open as though it had been read recently, and the letter had said it was from a Dr. Henry Marsh in Porter's Crossing, and the date on it was 8 months ago. She had not meant to read it. She read it. It was a response to an inquiry Cyrus had apparently made about obtaining a death certificate, a secondary copy, the original having been lost. Dr. Marsh confirmed that Eliza Wilcox had died of typhoid fever on December 3, 1881, and that the certificate of death had been filed with the county in January of 1882, and that a copy could be obtained from the county clerk's office in Denver at any time. She stood with the letter in her hand and understood without any ambiguity that Cyrus had told her his wife was gone, and that she had interpreted gone as abandoned, and that he had allowed her to interpret it that way. She did not immediately go looking for him. She put the letter back where she found it. She found the mathematics primer under a chair cushion. She went back to the schoolroom, and she sat for a long time thinking about why a man would allow a woman to believe the less painful thing when the truth was something else. The answer she arrived at, after considerable thinking, was that it was easier. Not for him, necessarily. Easier for the boys, who had apparently learned somehow to frame their mother's absence in terms of choice rather than tragedy. Because choice was something that could be resented and managed, and tragedy was something that had to be survived, and the surviving of it was not something a $40 a month schoolteacher from Boston was supposed to be part of. But this understanding, while intellectually satisfying, did not resolve the betrayal. She went to find him at supper, and she asked him to speak with her after the boys were in bed in the kitchen. And he looked at her face and knew immediately that something had changed, and he said only, "All right." The boys went to bed at their usual hour. 9 o'clock for Samuel because he was 14 and insisted on it. 8:30 for James. 8 for Thomas. And by 8:15 Thomas was already asleep because he had spent the afternoon running fence line calculations with Catherine for a mathematics lesson she had designed around practical applications, and he had covered about 4 miles of imaginary fence and was exhausted. And then Catherine went to the kitchen and she picked up the letter that she had put back that afternoon and that she had returned to get, because she had decided she wanted to have it in her hand when she spoke, not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as evidence of the specific shape of what had been withheld, and she waited. Cyrus came in from checking the horses, the last thing he always did before bed, and she said, "You lied to me." And the confrontation opened like a door onto everything that had been building. When Thomas appeared in the doorway with his sock feet and his careful eyes and asked if she was leaving, Catherine opened her own eyes and looked at the boy and felt the decision being made somewhere below the level of conscious choice, in the place where a person's actual commitments live. She said, "No, Thomas, I am not leaving. Go back to bed." Thomas looked at his father. Then he looked at Catherine. Then he turned around and went back up the stairs with the quiet confidence of a child who has been given a truthful answer and intends to trust it. When the sound of his footsteps had gone, Catherine set the letter down on the table between herself and Cyrus and said, "I need you to explain to me why." He sat down. He was still in the clothes he wore during the day, the canvas coat and the worn denim and the boots that had mud on them that he normally would have removed at the door and hadn't because she had started this conversation before he got the chance. And he put his hands flat on the table and he looked at them for a long moment before he looked at her. "Eliza died in December of '81, he said. "Thomas was 5. James was 9. Samuel was 12. I had a ranch to run and 3 boys who were," he started again. "The night she died I sat in this kitchen until morning came up, and I thought about how I was going to tell 3 children that the thing they most needed in the world was permanently unavailable. And then I got up and I went and I told them, and Samuel didn't cry. He just went very still in the way he goes still, and James cried until he was sick. And Thomas was 5 and he didn't understand yet, and so he kept asking for her for about 3 weeks and then he stopped asking, and I don't know which was worse." Catherine's throat tightened, but she did not speak. "I managed for a year and a half," Cyrus continued, "on my own. Ada helped when she could. I brought in a woman from town to help with the house a few times, but nobody stayed. And the boys' schooling it was bad. Samuel had taught himself out of Eliza's books, but James was falling behind, and Thomas wasn't learning to read properly, and I knew it and I couldn't fix it, and eventually I put the notice in the paper." "Why did you say she was gone rather than that she had died?" He looked up from his hands. "Because I knew if I said she had died, I would get women who were coming to do a kindness. Women who would feel sorry for the children. Women who would arrive full of sympathy and leave when the sympathy ran out." He held her gaze. "Your letter wasn't that. Your letter asked me if I had mathematics materials and what my expectations were regarding the duration of employment. You asked about the work. I thought if you knew about Eliza I thought it might change what you were coming for. You thought I might arrive with pity instead of professionalism," Catherine said. "Yes. And when I got here, when you met me and you knew from the first hour that pity was not something I was trafficking in." He was quiet for a moment. "By then I didn't know how to correct the impression without making it seem like I'd been deliberately hiding something, which I had been," he agreed. "Yes. Do the boys know how she died?" "They know she died of fever. They know it was fast. They don't talk about it. Particularly not Thomas, who I think has decided somewhere in the back of his mind that if he doesn't talk about it, he doesn't have to know it fully, which is a coping strategy I understand because it's mine too." The oil lamp between them flickered in a draft from the poorly sealed window over the sink, and the shadows moved across his face, and Catherine sat with everything he had just said and turned it over carefully. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter," she said. "The deception mattered. It matters that I came here with a false understanding of the situation. I know. But I also," she stopped. organized what she wanted to say. I also understand that grief does not always produce sensible decisions, and I understand why you wanted someone who was coming to do a job rather than perform a rescue. She folded her hands together on the table. So I am going to stay. I said I would stay and I will stay. But there will not be any more withheld truths, Cyrus. I need to know the actual situation of this household in order to do this job properly. All of it. Including things you think are uncomfortable to discuss. He looked at her with something that was unguarded and complicated and gone again so quickly she might have missed it if she had blinked. "All right," he said. "Good," she said. "Now, the other thing I noticed while I was looking for the mathematics primer is that your financial records are in a state of genuine crisis, and you have a fence on the north pasture boundary that has been repaired so many times that it needs to be replaced entirely. And if Beaumont is disputing your water rights, and you go into a negotiation with him without clean numbers, you are going to lose something you cannot afford to lose. Would you like to tell me about that now, or shall we address it in the morning?" He stared at her. "The finances," she clarified. "I'm very good at numbers. It's not my primary qualification, but it is a genuine one." He said slowly, "That's not what I expected you to say next." "What did you expect?" "Something more in the direction of outrage." "I'm capable of holding outrage and practicality at the same time," Catherine said. "I'm from Boston. We developed that skill early." He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to one, and it rearranged his face in ways that she catalogued without intending to, the way you notice something you are not supposed to be noticing. "Morning would be better," he said, "for the finances." "Morning it is," she said, and she got up and took the letter and put it in the drawer of her own desk in the schoolroom, because it was hers now in the sense that it had changed things, and she went to bed. She lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, which were very different from the sounds of Boston at night. No carriages, no voices, no particular human noise, but instead wind and the distant sound of cattle, and the creak of the house settling in the cooling temperature. And she thought about a man who had made a wrong choice for a complicated reason, and had not been able to find his way back from it until someone found it for him. She was not forgiving him. She was not yet in a place where forgiveness was the right word, but she understood him, and understanding was a beginning. The next morning she sat with him at the ranch business desk and they went through his financial records together, and the picture that emerged was concerning but not desperate. The ranch was viable. The cattle operation was solid. The main threat was Beaumont, whose claim on the eastern water access, if it prevailed in the county court, would reduce Cyrus's grazing capacity by roughly a third during dry months. He had a hearing scheduled in Denver in 6 weeks, and no lawyer, because lawyers cost money, he did not currently have in liquid form. Catherine said, "Tell me exactly what Beaumont's claim rests on." Cyrus explained. A deed of access that Beaumont's father had obtained from the previous landowner before Cyrus bought the property, which Beaumont claimed covered the water at the eastern creek during drought conditions, and which Cyrus's deed said had been superseded by the sale. "Do you have the original deed?" Catherine asked. "Yes." "And Beaumont's document?" "I have a copy he filed with the county." "Let me read both," she said. He gave them to her and she read them with the same focused attention she gave to a text she was planning to teach, and after half an hour she looked up and said, "The Beaumont document has a sunset clause. It was valid for a period of 10 years from date of issue. The date of issue was 1869. The 10-year period expired in 1879. You bought this property in 1878. He looked at the document, then he looked at her. "I didn't see that." "It's in the 4th paragraph," she said, "in language that is specifically designed not to draw attention to itself. Someone wrote this intentionally obscure." "Beaumont," Cyrus said, with a flatness in his voice that told her the history between these two men was longer and more unpleasant than he had indicated. "Has he been disputing this openly or quietly?" "Started quiet, went loud about 8 months ago. He's been cutting my fences on the eastern side. Not where it can be easily proven, but it's him. Lost 12 head last spring through gaps I know were closed. This was the moment Catherine understood that the situation at the Wilcox Ranch was not simply about 3 boys who needed a teacher. There was a dark past running underneath the property lines, a threat that was ongoing and deliberate, and a man who had been trying to handle it alone because that was what he knew how to do. "Write to the county clerk in Denver today," she said. "Request a certified copy of the Beaumont deed, because you need something that can be brought into a hearing. And write to a lawyer in Denver. There must be someone who handles property disputes, and send them this analysis. You don't need them in the room if they can give you the legal argument in writing, and you can deliver it yourself. You worked this out from a document you read for the first time this morning," he said. "I read carefully," she said, "and I was engaged once to a lawyer, which made me familiar with the ways legal language is used to obscure rather than clarify." There was a silence. "Was that the man?" Cyrus asked. "Edmund Price," she said, "attorney at law, a man of considerable legal precision and very little actual integrity." She stood up. "I need to start the boys' lesson, but write those letters today, Cyrus. Don't let this sit." He wrote the letters. She knew because she saw him at the desk that evening after dinner, the lamp close, his handwriting filling pages with more words than he usually spent. The relationship between Catherine and the boys was evolving in ways that she found daily fascinating and occasionally very moving. Samuel was her most difficult student, and also, she was beginning to think, potentially her best one. He had a rigorous mind that had been largely self-directed for 2 years, which meant his strengths were formidable, and his gaps were significant in specific and logical places. He had read widely but unsystematically. He could work through complex mathematical problems, but had never been taught the underlying principles that made mathematics coherent rather than arbitrary. He was resistant to instruction in the specific way that a person is resistant to instruction when they have survived by being their own instructor, and to accept help feels uncomfortably close to admitting that the survival had a cost. Catherine did not push him. She laid out what she was teaching and why, and she let him find his own way to wanting it. And about 3 weeks in, he started staying after the official lesson hours were done, sitting at his desk working through problems she had left, and she pretended not to notice so that he didn't have to acknowledge he was doing it. James was her most immediately rewarding student, quick and enthusiastic, and genuinely excited by ideas. The kind of boy who reads something and immediately wants to argue about it, which was a temperament Catherine respected deeply. He had opinions about history that were occasionally outrageous and always interesting. He was learning Latin from a primer she had brought in her trunk and approaching it as a puzzle to be solved rather than a language to be absorbed. He asked her once why they were learning Latin if nobody spoke it, and she told him that Latin was the architecture underneath English, and that understanding it was like understanding the studs behind a wall. You don't see them, but nothing hangs properly without them. James had thought about this and then gone and repeated it to Thomas, and Thomas had looked at her with those large brown eyes, and then gone to his slate and drawn what she could only describe as a wall with its inside revealed, showing the studs, labeled carefully in both English and the 5 Latin words he had just learned. Thomas communicated primarily through drawing. This had become clear to Catherine within the first 2 weeks, and rather than treating it as a deficit, she treated it as a mode, and she had started incorporating drawing into his lessons as a formal method, letting him diagram what he was learning before he wrote it, letting him use the visual as the bridge to the verbal. His reading had improved dramatically, and she did not think it was coincidental that it improved at the same time. She stopped requiring the written word to be the only form in which understanding was demonstrated. She told Cyrus about this one evening on the porch, explaining the connection between Thomas's visual thinking and the approach she was taking, and he listened with his full attention and then said, "Eliza used to say Thomas saw things." "He does," Catherine said, very clearly. She meant it as a worry, he said. She thought he stopped, started again. She thought he was not talking because something was wrong. The doctor in Porter's Crossing said he was fine, that he was developing normally, but she worried. "He's fine," Catherine said. "Better than fine. He sees the world with extraordinary accuracy, and he communicates it in the medium that works best for him. The talking will come more as he trusts the space." "He's talking more," Cyrus said. "Since you came, I've noticed." "He is," she said. "He talked for almost 10 uninterrupted minutes today about the fencing calculation we did for mathematics. He had a theory about the optimal corner post placement that was actually correct." Cyrus looked at her. In the fading light, his face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she was learning to read, which was the face of a man who was feeling something he had not given himself permission to feel, and was not entirely sure what to do about the feeling being there anyway. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing them." "They're not difficult to see," Catherine said. "They're very clear, all three of them. They just need someone to look directly at them instead of around them." She meant this entirely about the boys, and she also knew in some honest interior place that she was partly talking about their father as well. May moved into June in the Colorado Territory with a beauty that Catherine had genuinely not been prepared for. Not the cultivated, arranged beauty of a park or a garden, but the wild, enormous, unapologetic beauty of a landscape that had not been improved, because it did not need to be improved. The mountains were snow-capped until mid-June, and then the snow retreated upward, and the lower slopes went green in a way that seemed almost implausible, and wildflowers appeared in the meadows in quantities she had no names for. She asked Cyrus about the flowers once, and he stopped the wagon, which they were using to go to town for supplies, and he got down, and he named them for her one by one: the Indian paintbrush and the lupin and the blue columbine, and the ones whose names came from the settlers, and the ones whose names came from the Ute people who had lived in these mountains before the settlers, and who, as Cyrus explained with a matter-of-factness that she appreciated, had a considerably better understanding of the plant life than anyone who had arrived in the last 30 years. She thought about the way she had corrected the history book in the schoolroom, and she thought that Cyrus Wilcox was doing in this roadside moment what she had been trying to do in the classroom, acknowledging the full story without pretending it was simpler than it was. "You think about things more carefully than you let on," she told him. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "How do you mean?" "You present yourself as a practical man, which you are. But the way you talk about this land, about the people who were here before, it's not the way a man who only thinks practically talks." He was quiet for a moment. "Eliza had opinions about it," he said. "Strong ones. She thought the thing most people called progress was something else if you looked at it from the other direction." He paused. "She was not wrong about most things." "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Catherine said. He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and slightly stunned, as though she had said the one thing he had not anticipated. "She would have liked you too," he said. "She had no patience for people who weren't honest." They drove the rest of the way to town in the comfortable silence of two people who have said something real to each other, and are giving it room to exist. In Dust Creek, they collected supplies, and Catherine spent 15 minutes in conversation with Ada Chen, Cyrus's neighbor, who was a small, precise woman in her mid-40s who had come from Canton as a young woman with a husband who had died of cholera in 1875, and who had subsequently built herself a laundry business in Dust Creek by being the hardest-working person in the territory, which was, as she explained to Catherine with calm directness, the main option available to a Chinese woman in a Colorado town, where the reception was friendly, but the opportunities were limited. Ada told Catherine that Cyrus Wilcox was a good man who had had a very hard 2 years and who needed someone to stop him from running himself into the ground through sheer obligation, and she told her this in the same tone you use to tell someone the weather forecast, as basic useful information. "He does not tend to himself," Ada said. "He tends the ranch, he tends the boys, he does not tend Cyrus." I'm here to teach the boys, Catherine said. Ada gave her a look that was very patient and not at all confused. Of course you are, she said. The letter from the lawyer in Denver arrived at the end of June. He confirmed Catherine's reading of the Sunset Clause and told Cyrus the Beaumont claim was not legally sound, and offered to prepare a written brief for the county hearing in exchange for a fee that was steep but, based on what it might save, not unreasonable. He also recommended that Cyrus document any fence damage with witnesses where possible, as additional evidence of bad faith on Beaumont's part. Cyrus showed Catherine the letter. She read it and said, "He's right about the documentation. Do you have anyone who's seen the fence damage? Ed Marsh was with me when we found the gap in April," he said. "He's a neighbor to the north, reliable. Ask him to write a statement. Date, location, what he observed, keep it factual." "You've done this before," Cyrus said. "No, but I've observed it being done." She paused. "Edmund Price was very thorough about documentation." "I see," he said. He seemed about to say something else and then didn't. She didn't press. But the next morning when she came down to start the stove, he was already in the kitchen, which was unusual, and he had made coffee, which was more unusual, and he was sitting at the table with the look of a man who had decided to say something and was gathering the courage to begin. She sat down across from him and poured coffee and waited. "I need to say something," he said. "That I should have said earlier and didn't because I'm not good at this." "All right," she said. "When you came here I told myself the situation was professional, that you were a teacher and I needed a teacher, and that was the whole of it." He looked at his coffee cup. "That has become not the whole of it." The kitchen was very quiet. "What has it become?" Catherine said. He looked up at her. "Something I don't know what to do with. And something that is yours to respond to however you see fit, because I am aware that I am your employer and you are here on professional terms and I have no right to complicate that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "You're not Edmund Price." "No," he said, "I'm not. Edmund Price made decisions about what I wanted and then implemented them on my behalf. He never asked me anything. He informed me." She put her hands around the coffee cup. "So I'm going to tell you what I want because I think you're actually asking. What I want is to finish this cup of coffee, and then to go wake the boys for lessons. And then tonight, after dinner, to continue the conversation we have apparently been having obliquely for 6 weeks and do it more directly. Can you manage that?" he said. "Yes." The conversation that evening on the porch was the kind of conversation that happens between two people who have been talking around the real subject for long enough that, when they finally arrive at it, they are both somewhat exhausted by the detour and somewhat grateful to be in the same actual territory at last. She told him about Edmund in more detail, about the 2 years she had spent believing she understood who he was, and then the 3 months of discovering she hadn't, and about the specific particular loneliness of being in a relationship and discovering the other person was not actually present in it, just performing presence. He told her about Eliza, not as a comparison or a caution, but as a part of the story of who he was. They had married young, 20 and 22, which was not unusual in the territory in the mid-1870s. They had grown up together in some ways and grown sideways in others, two people who had chosen each other before they were fully formed, and had then had to figure out how to continue choosing each other as the full shapes of their characters emerged. It had not been easy, and it had not been simple, and it had been, in most of the ways that counted, real. "She would have wanted me to be happy," he said. "I know that. I'm not saying it to make it easier for either of us. She was a direct woman and she was clear about what she valued, and one of the things she valued was me not running myself dead for the ranch." "And yet," Catherine said. "And yet," he agreed, "here I am running myself fairly dead for the ranch. And the boys, he looked out at the darkening meadow. They're doing better than they've done in 2 years, all 3 of them. You can see it." He looked at her. "You did that." "They did that," she said. "I just showed up consistently and expected things of them. That's not complicated. For someone who doesn't understand why it's necessary," he said, It is. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that he had been present but not consistent, that the grief and the work and the 3 boys and the ranch had all demanded things simultaneously, and he had moved between them doing what the moment required and losing the through line that children needed more than any individual thing you could give them. She said, "You could not have done it differently. You were alone." "I know that," he said, "but knowing it doesn't entirely remove the weight." She sat with him in the quiet for a while longer, and then she said, "I'm not going to leave in the fall. I want you to know that. I took this position for a year and I intend to stay for a year, and at the end of a year we can reassess. But I am not going anywhere until these boys are further along than they were when I came." He looked at her. That's not what I was asking about." "I know it's not," she said, but it seemed relevant to say, "Whatever else we are figuring out, the professional situation is stable. I am staying. That's not conditional on anything." "Why are you telling me that first?" "Because you need to know it isn't complicated by anything else," she said. "What happens between us isn't going to affect whether I stay and do my job. I stay and do my job regardless. What happens between us is entirely separate." "Is something going to happen between us?" he said, and his voice was careful and not quite neutral. She looked at him in the last of the evening light. He looked back. The distance between them on that porch, perhaps 3 feet, felt very specific. "I think something has already been happening between us for most of the summer," she said. "I think we are both aware of it. And I think we can continue to be aware of it thoughtfully and without rushing anything, given that we have presumably time." He said, "We have time," and the way he said it made it sound like a commitment, which she supposed it was. On a Tuesday morning in early August, the Beaumont situation arrived at the ranch in the form of 3 men on horseback, who came up the road without invitation, and sat on their horses in the yard in the way men sit on horses when they want their horses to be part of the statement they are making. Beaumont himself was a large man in his late 40s, with a mustache that he appeared to have grown for the specific purpose of looking formidable, and which was mostly succeeding. He had 2 ranch hands with him, younger men, with the closed expressions of people being paid to be present, and not required to have opinions. Catherine was in the schoolroom with the boys when she heard the horses arrive, and she told them to continue their work, and she went to the window. Samuel had already moved to the window before she did, which told her he recognized the sound of trouble in the same way his father did, as something you oriented toward rather than away from. Cyrus had come out of the barn at the sound of hooves, and he was standing in the yard with his hands loose at his sides, and his posture communicating clearly that he was aware of the dynamic being performed, and was not intimidated by it. Beaumont said something she couldn't hear through the glass. Cyrus replied briefly. Beaumont said something longer, his voice rising at the end so that she caught the last few words, which were "last chance before I take this to the judge." Cyrus said something she could not hear but which was apparently the wrong response because Beaumont's face reddened visibly from 30 feet away. She told the boys, "Continue with your reading. Samuel, you are in charge of the room," and she went outside. She came around the side of the porch and walked into the yard, and she said, in the clear carrying voice she used when she needed an entire classroom to hear her, "Good morning. Can I help you, Mr. Beaumont?" Beaumont looked at her. His horse shifted. "Who are you?" "Catherine Fletcher. I am employed on this ranch." She stood at Cyrus's right and slightly ahead, which was a deliberate positioning. "I understand you have a dispute with Mr. Wilcox regarding water access on the eastern boundary. That dispute is scheduled to be heard by the county in September, which I believe gives everyone adequate time to prepare their respective legal arguments." She smiled. "Is there something else that brings you here this morning?" Beaumont looked at her for a long moment, then at Cyrus, then back at her. "This is a ranch matter," he said. "The financial and legal situation of this ranch is within my purview," she said. "As someone who has reviewed the relevant documentation, I'd be happy to discuss the specific language of the 1869 deed and its sunset clause if that would be useful." The word sunset clause produced a visible response in Beaumont's face, a tightening around the eyes that told her he knew exactly what the sunset clause said and had been hoping Cyrus did not. "September," she said pleasantly. "We'll look forward to seeing you there." After a moment, Beaumont pulled his horse around, and the three of them left the way they had come. Catherine watched until they were out of sight, and then she turned to find Cyrus looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, one of which was something she was fairly confident was admiration. "The sunset clause," he said. "I wanted him to know we know," she said. "Taking a legal position you know is indefensible in private negotiation is a form of fraud. He'll either drop the claim or modify it before September, because he won't want a judge to see how he was pressing it." "You're very good at this," he said. "I'm very good at reading people who are using language strategically," she said. "I learned from a professional." She went back inside to the schoolroom, where Samuel had apparently kept excellent order because all three boys were at their desks and the reading was continuing, although Thomas's eyes went immediately to her face when she came in to check whether everything was resolved. She nodded at him. He nodded back and returned to his work. As predicted, Beaumont withdrew his claim in mid-August, 2 weeks before the hearing. The letter came through the county office, and Cyrus brought it to her in the schoolroom during a lesson, and she read it and said, "Good," and handed it back and told James to continue conjugating his Latin verbs. That evening Cyrus brought a bottle of whiskey from the pantry where it was kept for specific occasions, and he poured 2 small glasses and he put one in front of her and she said, "I don't drink whiskey," he said. "I thought you might make an exception." She looked at the glass and then at him, and then she picked it up and took a small sip that confirmed her suspicion that she did not like whiskey but which was, in the context, entirely worth it. They sat at the kitchen table and he said, "The ranch is safe." "The ranch is safe," she confirmed. "Because you read carefully," he said. "Because you wrote the letter and hired the lawyer," she said. "I read a document, you did the rest. You also intimidated Beaumont from the front yard of my house." "I had a legal argument," she said. "That's not intimidation, that's information." He was smiling. The full version, not the almost version, and it was a remarkable transformation of his face, the way it opened up, the lines around his eyes deepening in a way that was very different from the lines they made when he was worried, warmer and more mobile. She looked at him smiling and felt something settle into place, a certainty about something she had been uncertain about, the way a compass needle settles after you stop turning it. "Cyrus," she said. "Catherine," he said. She said, "I think I have been falling in love with you since approximately the 2nd week of April, and I have been very disciplined about it, which has been an effort, and I thought you should know." He looked at her for a long, completely still moment. Then he said, "I have been falling in love with you since you told Samuel that history is incomplete," and watched his face change, and kept going as though watching a 14-year-old have his first real intellectual experience was not the most important thing that had happened in this house in 2 years. "That's very specific," she said. "I think about specific things," he said. He reached across the table and he put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the Colorado night was doing what it did in August, coming down cool and enormous and smelling of pine and distance, and it was exactly enough. The boys found out in stages, which was inevitable. James found out first, because James was constitutionally incapable of not noticing things, and had been tracking the evening porch conversations with the systematic interest of a natural scientist. He knocked on Catherine's door on a Saturday morning, and when she opened it he said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry my father?" Catherine said, "That is a very direct question." "I'm a direct person," James said. "You taught me it was better to be direct." "I did," she acknowledged. "Sit down." She indicated the chair by her window. He sat. She sat on the edge of her bed. "Your father and I care for each other. What happens from there is something we're working out carefully because it involves you and your brothers, and we are both aware of that." "I think you should marry him," James said. "He's happier. He was unhappy before. Not in a way he'd say out loud, but I'm 11 and I'm not wrong. You're not wrong, she said. Thomas thinks so too, James added. He told me. Thomas told you. This was notable because Thomas, while increasingly verbal within the family, still conserved words with the care of someone who understood their weight. He said, "She should stay forever," James reported. "That's a lot of words for Thomas." "It is," Catherine said, with something happening in her chest that she recognized as the feeling of a decision becoming clearer. Samuel took longer. Samuel was carrying something that none of them had quite named, and Catherine understood that for Samuel, who had been 12 when his mother died, and who had therefore been old enough to feel the shape of the loss clearly, the possibility of something new was not simple, uncomplicated good news. She found him in the barn one afternoon in mid-September, after the others were in bed, cleaning tack in the methodical way he did the tasks he'd assigned himself as the oldest, and she sat down on a hay bale and didn't say anything for a while, and after a while he said, "You're going to stay?" "Yes," she said, "permanently. That's what we're moving toward." He was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the leather. "My mother," he stopped. She wasn't the easiest person. But she was ours. "I know," Catherine said. "I'm not asking you to replace her. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it's something you should do." He looked at her. "Then what are you asking?" "I'm not asking anything," she said. "I'm telling you what is going to happen so you're not surprised by it. Your father and I are in love. We are going to get married, we hope, in the spring, if that is the timing that makes sense. I am going to be your stepmother. You are going to decide what that means to you, and I am going to respect whatever you decide. And in the meantime, I am going to continue being exactly who I have been since April, which is your teacher and someone who takes your education seriously and treats you as the capable person you are." Samuel looked at her for a long time. "You're not going to try to be her," he said. "I could not be her if I tried," Catherine said. "I am something different, a different kind of presence in this house. Whether that becomes something you want or just something you accept is up to you. Both are honest, and I will not pressure you toward either." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She would have liked you." It was, she realized, almost exactly what Cyrus had said, and the fact that the two of them had arrived at the same conclusion independently was a kind of information about a woman she had never met that felt important and tender. "I think I would have liked her too," Catherine said. He went back to the tack. She sat on the hay bale a while longer. When she got up to leave, he said, without looking up, "Thank you for the mathematics. I passed the calculation for the North Pasture survey completely on my own." "I know," she said. "Your father told me. He was proud." Samuel's hand stilled for a moment. "Did he say that?" "He said exactly that." He nodded, still looking at the leather, and she went inside and let him have the barn and the quiet and whatever he needed to do with the information. Cyrus proposed in October, on the porch, in the late afternoon light when the aspens had gone gold, and the mountains were doing the particular thing they did in October in Colorado, which was to become so beautiful they seemed almost constructed, a deliberate argument about what a landscape could be. He did not have a ring. He explained this straightforwardly. He had sent to Denver for one, and it had not yet arrived, which was a logistical reality of the frontier and not a reflection of the sincerity of the intention. He said, "I know this is not the proposal a woman from Boston might expect. There is no parlor and no formal occasion. There is a porch and a very good view and a man who is not eloquent but is serious." Catherine said, "I have not wanted an eloquent man for some time. I had an eloquent man. He was efficient with words and inefficient with truth." He said, "Catherine Fletcher, I am asking you to marry me because I have not been as honestly happy as I am when I am with you since before I understood what honest happiness was. Because my sons are becoming their best selves in your presence. Because you walked into a difficult situation and made it better through nothing but consistency and intelligence and care. And because I love you in a way that feels like the kind of love that has roots instead of just flowers." She was quiet for a moment, She said, "Yes, Cyrus, I will marry you." He took her hand. They sat in the gold October light and watched the aspens turn in the wind, and the valley below the ranch was going amber and rust. And somewhere in the lower pasture, three boys were doing something audible that she could not quite identify, but that sounded, from the intermittent shouting, like it involved either a great triumph or a moderate catastrophe. And she was happy, actually and completely happy, in a way that had the roots he had described. The ring arrived 2 weeks later from Denver, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it. And when Cyrus put it on her finger, she looked at it and thought that it was exactly right. Not ornate, not showy, real in the way that everything about this place was real. The winter that followed was the winter Catherine would think of for the rest of her life as the first real winter, which was not the first winter she had experienced, but the first she had experienced from the inside of something, a life that was being built rather than a position she was temporarily occupying. She helped the boys with their lessons through the short cold days when snow kept them inside, and she cooked, and she read in the evenings, and she and Cyrus talked for hours across the kitchen table. And on the cold nights the house held warmth in the way a well-built house does, stubbornly and with conviction. Samuel turned 15 in November, and James turned 12 in December, and Thomas turned 8 in February, and Catherine bought Thomas a proper artist's sketchbook from the general store in Dust Creek, and a set of drawing pencils, and he looked at them for a long time before he looked up at her and said, in his careful way, "This is the best thing I have ever gotten." "You are the best observer I have ever taught," she said. "The tools should be proportionate." He hugged her. It was the first time he had initiated physical affection, and she held him and thought about the specific way a very careful child gives himself over to a thing when he finally decides it is safe, completely and without reservation. The wedding was in March of 1884, at the Dust Creek Church, on a day when the snow had pulled back enough for there to be mud in the road and a thin, hopeful sun. And Ada Chen stood beside Catherine, and Ed Marsh stood beside Cyrus, and the three boys sat in the first pew. Samuel with his arms crossed and his face controlled and his eyes wet, James with a grin that had not moved since morning, and Thomas with his sketchbook open on his lap, drawing the scene as it happened. The small church, and the people in it, and his father and Catherine Fletcher standing in front of the minister. The minister was a man named Reverend Holt, who had been in Dust Creek for 3 years and who conducted himself, as Catherine had discovered when they spoke about the ceremony, with a genuine goodwill that was not complicated by condescension, and who kept the service appropriately brief and appropriately sincere. Cyrus said his vows looking directly at her, without looking at the floor or the ceiling or the middle distance, and his voice was steady with the steadiness of someone who means what they are saying and does not feel the need to perform the meaning. She said hers the same way. James made a sound that was not quite a cheer when they were pronounced married, and was close enough that several people in the pews smiled. And Thomas looked up from his sketchbook and gave her a nod that was the most Thomas possible response to the most important moment in the room. Samuel did not cry, technically, because he was 15 and had decided crying was complicated. But when Catherine went to him after the ceremony and put her hand on his arm, he covered her hand with his briefly, just for a moment, and then let go. It was enough. It was more than enough. The spring and summer that followed were the fullest Catherine had lived. The ranch moved into a new season with the water rights settled and the fences replaced, and the cattle numbers holding steady, and the boys' lessons continued to produce the kind of results that made her genuinely proud, not of herself, but of them. Samuel passed a written examination Catherine designed to test his preparedness for further formal education, a rigorous assessment in mathematics, natural science, history, and literature. And he passed it at a level that made her write a letter to a school in Denver that offered secondary education for young men, because he deserved more than she could provide, and it was one of the harder and more necessary things she had ever done. recommending a student for something that would take him away from the daily life of her table. He received an offer of enrollment in September. He was going to Denver in the fall. The night he told his father, Cyrus sat very still at the table for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother would have wanted this." And Samuel nodded once, and the two of them held the shared understanding of Eliza Wilcox between them in a way that Catherine did not intrude on, because it was not hers to intrude on, and she was glad they had it. In June of 1884, Catherine understood that she was expecting a child. She told Cyrus on a morning in early July when the summer was at its height, and the meadow below the ranch was everything that the Colorado Territory promised itself it would be, full and green and loud with birds. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he took her face in both his hands, and he kissed her with the full force of everything he was, which was considerable. And when he finally let her breathe, she said, "I will take that as a positive response." He said, "Catherine," and that was the whole sentence, just her name, but the way he said it was a complete paragraph. The boys found out that evening. James's response was immediate and enthusiastic, and involved a series of questions about the logistics of infant development that revealed he had been paying close attention during the natural science lessons. Thomas sat with his sketchbook and began drawing something that he didn't show anyone for 2 days, and when he finally showed Catherine, it was the family, all 5 of them plus the suggested presence of a new one, arranged in front of the ranch house in morning light, and it was so accurate to the actual people it depicted, so clearly seen, that she had to sit down. Samuel, who had 2 months before he left for Denver, listened to the announcement and then said, "I'll be back in December. For Christmas." "Yes," Cyrus said, "you will. I want to meet them by then," Samuel said. "The baby." "We'll do our best," Catherine said. The baby arrived in late February of 1885, which was a few weeks earlier than the expected time, and Ada Chen was present and competent and calm in the way she was calm about everything. And the child who came into the world in the upstairs bedroom of the Wilcox Ranch on a cold February night was a boy, which James received with the outrage of someone who had been certain, based on his theoretical understanding of probability, that the outcome should have been a girl. He was a healthy and emphatic boy with dark hair like his father and eyes that were, in those first weeks, the unfixed color of all new things, and they named him Daniel after Catherine's father, which was a decision she had made in the last weeks of the pregnancy, and which Cyrus had agreed to without hesitation. Thomas sat beside the bed where Catherine was resting after everything was done, with the baby in the crook of his arm, very still and very careful, and he looked at his new brother for a long time, and then he said, "He looks like a serious person." Catherine laughed, which surprised her because she was also tired and also moved beyond easy expression. "He does," she said. "We'll see if he grows into it." "I can draw him," Thomas said. "I would love that," she said. He drew Daniel every week for the first year of the baby's life, a record of a small person becoming himself in stages that was more detailed and more accurate than any photograph could have been, because Thomas drew not just what Daniel looked like but what he was, the specific quality of attention in his eyes, the way he held his hands, the first real laugh. The first time he sat up without help and looked around with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world is considerably larger than previously estimated. Samuel came home for Christmas and again in the summer of 1885, and the relationship between him and Catherine, which had always been complicated by his particular kind of loyalty and his particular kind of grief, became something more straightforward over time, not easy in a simple sense, but honest in a way that was better than easy. He was a different young man at school, more focused, more confident, and he brought home ideas in December that he and Catherine argued about across the dinner table for 3 days in the way they had always argued, which was to say productively and with genuine respect. He was back at school in January and did not feel gone in the way she had feared, because the letters arrived weekly and they were detailed and they were him, entirely him, and she wrote back just as consistently and at equal length. Daniel grew through his first year into a child who was, as Thomas had predicted, a serious person. He approached everything with intense, deliberate concentration, including the act of walking, which he performed for the first time at 11 months, with the expression of someone completing a mission they have been planning for some time. He did not talk early, but when he talked, he was comprehensible and purposeful, and Catherine recognized in this something of both his father's economy with words and her own tendency toward precision. James taught Daniel to ride a horse at an age Catherine considered frankly irresponsible and which Cyrus approved of, and the lesson took place in the lower pasture, with James narrating extensively in a pedagogical style that was clearly an imitation of Catherine's classroom manner, which she found simultaneously flattering and mildly alarming. Thomas continued to draw, and by the time he was 12 was producing work of such quality that Ada Chen, who had connected over the years with a network of people in Denver who dealt in art and cultural goods, suggested tentatively that his work might be of interest to people beyond Dust Creek. Catherine wrote a careful letter to a woman in Denver she had heard of through Ada, a Mrs. Patricia Vance who ran an arts society, and enclosed 2 of Thomas's drawings. The response was enthusiastic and slightly astonished, and this information was delivered to Thomas on a Tuesday evening by both his father and Catherine together, because they had agreed that important news should be delivered by both parents and they were both his parents, and Thomas listened to the letter being read aloud and looked at his sketchbook and said, "I need to do more work." "You have time," Cyrus said. "There's always more to see," Thomas said, and went to his room to draw. By the fall of 1886, the ranch had expanded into the north pasture that Cyrus had been planning for 3 years, and the cattle operation was the most stable it had been since before Eliza's death, and Catherine was expecting again, which she told Cyrus on the same porch where he had proposed to her on an October evening with the aspens gold again, as they were every October, reliably and beautifully gold. He said, "A girl this time, perhaps." "Perhaps," she said. "Though we should perhaps not prejudge." He took her hand. They sat in the familiar quiet of the porch in October, the ranch spread below them in the evening light, and the sound of James and Daniel somewhere in the lower pasture doing something that sounded significantly more athletic than necessary, and Thomas visible through the window of his room, the lamp lit, bent over his sketchbook. This baby, arriving in April of 1887, was indeed a girl, which pleased James enormously on the grounds of probability being restored, and she came into the world as Catherine's April children apparently came, emphatic and clear-voiced and certain about being present. They named her Eliza. The decision had come to Catherine slowly, over months, as she watched Cyrus with the boys and watched Samuel come home each December more himself, and watched Thomas begin to articulate in his drawings a vision of the world that was entirely his own, and she understood that Eliza Wilcox was not a ghost in this house but a foundation, and the best thing a foundation could be was named and acknowledged and not pretended away. She told Cyrus what she wanted to name the baby in February before the birth, so there would be time to think about it and not just react. He was quiet for a long time. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to," she said. "She built something here. These boys are her work as much as anything. I'm standing in a house she loved. I would like there to be an Eliza in it again." He could not speak for a moment, which was rare and complete and something she held carefully. "Thank you," he finally said. "She would have liked the name anyway," Catherine said. "It's a serious name. Our daughter will probably be a serious person." She was. Eliza Wilcox, small Eliza, as Thomas immediately began calling her to distinguish, though the original Eliza existed now more in pictures and in stories than in living distinction, was a serious and determined person from the first weeks of her life, with her father's dark coloring and her mother's direct gaze, and the combined stubbornness of both of them in a package that fit in the crook of one arm and communicated total authority, despite this limitation. Daniel adored her with a completeness that was immediate and slightly overwhelming to observe. He was 2 years old, and he appointed himself her guardian with the solemnity of someone accepting a permanent commission, and the sight of him sitting beside her cradle explaining things to her in his precise, careful voice, things about the ranch and the horses and the mountains and whatever else occurred to him, was something that made Cyrus and Catherine look at each other across the room with the wordless communication of people who have built something together and are looking at it and finding it very good. Samuel came home in December of 1887 with his school completed and a plan. He had been offered a position with a land surveying company in Denver, which was work that suited his mathematical precision and his love for the actual physical reality of land, and he was going to take it. He was not, he explained at the dinner table on his second evening home, going away permanently. He was going to Denver. He would come back in the summers and at Christmas. The ranch was, he looked at his father and then at Catherine and then at the table. The ranch was home. He just needed to be in Denver to do the work he was drawn to. That's good, Cyrus said. That's exactly right. Samuel looked at him. You're not, I'm proud of you, Cyrus said. And your mother would be proud of you, both of them. Samuel looked at Catherine. She looked back at him steadily. He said, thank you for the letter of recommendation for the examinations, for he stopped, for taking us seriously from the beginning. You were always easy to take seriously, she said. I just showed up and looked directly at you. You did everything else. He left in January, and the house was different without him, but not diminished, because the person who was gone had gone toward his own life, and that was the correct direction. James, at 15 in December of 1887, was beginning to think about his own future with the systematic enthusiasm he applied to everything, and what he was thinking about was medicine. This had been a long-developing interest that Catherine had watched grow from his early fascination with natural science through a sustained engagement with the one medical textbook in the household, and a series of increasingly intense conversations with the doctor in Porter's Crossing, a man named Dr. Aldridge, who had apparently recognized a genuine aptitude and had been encouraging James to read further. She wrote to Dr. Aldridge on James's behalf, and she wrote to a physician in Denver who had a connection to a medical school in St. Louis, and she began assembling for James the kind of educational pathway that was available to a boy in Colorado Territory in 1888, which was more limited than it should have been but not impossible. James received all of this with focused appreciation and the particular brand of direct affection he had always offered, which was loud and immediate and entirely genuine. You think I can actually do it, he said to her one evening. I think you have been capable of it since you were 11 years old and interrogating me about whether I really knew mathematics, she said. The question is just how you get from here to there. You'll help me figure it out. That is what I am for, she said. He hugged her in the enthusiastic full-force way that was his signature, which had not diminished appreciably in the 6 years she had known him. Thomas, at 16, was quietly extraordinary. He had sold 3 drawings to the Denver Art Society through Ada's connection, a transaction that had produced money he immediately invested back into better materials, and which had the effect of making him more serious about the work in the way that being taken seriously always makes a person more serious about what they do. He was also, Catherine had noticed in recent months, interested in a girl named Clara Hartley who lived on a neighboring farm to the north and who had hair the color of red cedar and the kind of focused quiet that suggested Thomas had excellent instincts. She did not say anything about Clara to Thomas. He would speak about her when he was ready, and Thomas was always ready precisely when the time was right. In the spring of 1888, with the ranch in full operation and the cattle season beginning and Daniel at 3 years old, attempting to convince anyone who would listen that he was ready to work alongside the ranch hands and Eliza, at 1 year old, standing with impressive determination, and looking at everything with the eyes that were her mother's and the posture that was her father's. Catherine sat on the porch of the Wilcox Ranch on an April morning exactly 5 years from the day she had first arrived. And she thought about a notice in a newspaper, and a woman who had been afraid and angry and brave in approximately equal measure, and who had written a letter to a stranger in Colorado. She had come for the boys. This was true. She had come because 3 boys needed a teacher, and the work was real and the need was real, and those things had all proven to be exactly what they were advertised as. But she had stayed for something larger than the job description, for the specific shape of Cyrus Wilcox holding himself still in the yard while watching the stage arrive, for Thomas and his sketchbook and his careful eyes, for James and his uncontainable enthusiasm for every idea that came within his radius, for Samuel and the slow and real and meaningful movement of his trust, for the way the aspens went gold in October, and the mountains shed snow in June, and the creek ran silver at the edge of the property in every season, for the life that had been built here out of grief and difficulty, and love and stubbornness, and 2 people who had been willing to be honest with each other even when it was inconvenient and occasionally painful. She heard Cyrus's boots on the porch behind her, and then he was sitting in the other chair, the way he had sat on 100 evenings, except that this morning it was morning and there was coffee in both their hands and the world was at its most undeniably good. He said, 5 years ago today. Yes, she said. You came in on the afternoon stage covered in Colorado dust. I did, she said. You were standing by the depot. I was terrified, he said. She looked at him. Of me. Of the whole situation, he said. A schoolteacher from Boston coming out to see what we'd made of ourselves. I spent the whole drive back from town trying to figure out if I had made a mistake by writing the honest letter instead of the impressive one. The honest letter was the reason I came, she said. I know that now, he said. I did not know it then. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it that first wagon ride when he helped her up to the seat, and she had noticed the honest calluses, except that she knew him now in the full and particular way that 5 years of complete daily presence produces, and his hand in hers was as familiar as breathing and as necessary. Are you happy? She asked him. She asked it not because she did not know the answer, but because she liked hearing the answer. He said, Catherine, I am the most content I have ever been in my life, which is not the same as saying there are no difficulties, because there are always difficulties. But the difficulties are the kind you can face when you have the right person beside you, and I have the right person beside you. Beside you, she corrected. That's what I said, he agreed. Daniel appeared around the corner of the porch at a determined trot, wearing his hat at an angle that suggested he had put it on himself without benefit of a mirror, and behind him came the sound of Eliza inside, vocalizing with authority about something that required adult attention. Thomas's window upstairs was already open, the morning light on it, which meant he was up and working, the lamp unnecessary in April. James's horse was gone from the near paddock because James went every Wednesday to Porter's Crossing to read with Dr. Aldridge, a habit that had been going on for 6 months and would eventually, all of them knew, take him further east toward the education he needed. Samuel's last letter sat on the kitchen table, dated 2 weeks ago from Denver, full of specifics about the land survey work and a casual mention of a woman he had met named Rachel who was, he wrote with considerable understatement, interesting. The ranch was alive around them, the May morning beginning to do its full work with the birds and the light and the cattle moving in the lower pasture and the creek catching the sun and throwing it back. Catherine held her husband's hand and felt the weight of Eliza from inside the house demanding attention, and looked at Daniel approaching the porch steps with complete confidence in his right to be present. And she thought about what it meant to come for one thing, and find that the thing you were given was larger than the thing you had been looking for. She had come to be a teacher. She had been given 3 students who became, in ways that could not be fully described, her sons in the most honest sense of the word, which is not the legal sense or the biological sense, but the sense of people you have watched carefully and helped become themselves and love with the specific pride of someone who knows what the raw material was and can see what it has become. She had been given Cyrus, who was a man of few words and total honesty, and whose love was the kind that did not perform itself, but simply was, the way the ranch was, present and solid, and requiring maintenance and worth every bit of the effort. She had been given this particular valley and these particular mountains, and the aspens that went gold every October, and the creek that ran in all seasons, and the sky at this altitude which was a color of blue that she had genuinely not believed existed until she saw it the first time. She had been given a second chance at a life, which she had not known she needed until the evening in Boston when Edmund Price had taken his careful, cowardly leave and left her alone with her own courage, which turned out to be, in sufficient quantities, the only thing she ever really needed. Eliza's voice inside the house reached a new register of insistence, and Catherine set down her coffee and got to her feet, and Cyrus got to his feet at the same time and said, "I'll get her." "We'll both go," Catherine said. He took her hand and they went inside together, into the warm house that smelled of coffee and morning, and the specific lived-in smell of a family that had taken root in a place, and intended to stay there, into the sound of Eliza and the approaching sound of Daniel's boots on the steps behind them, into the life that had been assembled here out of love and difficulty, and the particular kind of courage it takes to write an honest letter to a stranger, and trust that honesty is a language that translates across any distance. The sun came full into the kitchen windows and lit the room from the east, and outside the mountains stood as they stood every morning, enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to human happiness but beautiful regardless. And inside the Wilcox ranch house, a family was beginning its Tuesday, and everything was, at last and completely and without reservation, exactly as it should be.